The bitter winter of 1872 had descended on the English countryside, its icy breath whipping through the trees and settling in the very bones of the land. At the gates of Blackmore Manor, snow piled high against the wrought iron fence, creating an impenetrable wall of white. On a cold wooden bench near the gate, a woman sat alone, her breath thin in the frigid air, her hands trembling around a small satchel that held only a few coins and her professional training. Clara Whitfield had nowhere left to turn. She had fled London after her reputation was ruined by a powerful physician who destroyed her career with a single lie. A nurse trained with skill, but cast aside like a forgotten thing. Now, in the cruel night, she was left to face the storm with nothing but her past and the bitter cold closing in on her. Then the gates creaked, and through the swirling snow, a figure appeared, tall, dark, and imposing. Francis Hargrave, Duke of Blackmore, a man whose cold, calculating eyes had seen more than most, stepped out from behind the iron gates. His gaze studied her for a moment, calculating, before he spoke with an eerie certainty, "You'll die here if I don't do something." It wasn't kindness that moved him first. It was the simple fact that he didn't tolerate weakness, and in this woman, freezing before him, there was something unmistakable. Something that demanded action. With no hesitation, he crossed the snow-covered ground, and before she could protest, he had her in his arms and was carrying her into his manor. What he didn't know was that his decision would change both their fates forever. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting updates. Now let's continue the story. The world had narrowed to nothing but cold. Clara Whitfield could no longer feel her fingers where they clutched the leather handle of her medical satchel. The wool of her cloak, once a comfort, now felt like little more than paper against the relentless wind that howled through the iron gates of Blackmore Manor. She had been sitting on that bench for what felt like hours, though it might have been only minutes. Time had a strange way of stretching when death crept close. Her thoughts had become sluggish, drifting like the snow that gathered in the folds of her skirt. She thought of London, of the hospital where she had trained, of the warmth of the surgical theater where she had once felt purpose and pride. That life was gone now, destroyed by a single accusation she had dared to make, and the powerful man who had crushed her for it. The gates before her were massive, ornate things, wrought iron twisted into patterns that spoke of wealth and old lineage. Beyond them, through the veil of falling snow, she could just make out the dark silhouette of the manor house itself. Even the name sounded forbidding. She had come here with no plan, only desperation. Someone in the village had mentioned that the Duke of Blackmore sometimes took on staff, that he was a hard man but fair. It was a thin hope, thinner than the ice forming on her eyelashes, but it was all she had left. Her head drooped forward. The satchel slipped from her fingers and landed softly in the snow at her feet. She should pick it up. It contained everything that proved she was more than a vagrant. Her training certificates, her references from before the scandal, the small surgical tools she had managed to keep. But her arms would not obey her. The cold had sunk too deep. This is how it ends, she thought distantly. Frozen on a stranger's doorstep, miles from anyone who ever cared. Then the gate moved. The screech of iron against ice cut through the storm's howl. Clara's head lifted slightly, her vision blurred, but she could make out a figure emerging from the swirling white. Tall, dark coat, broad shoulders that seemed to part the snow itself as he walked toward her. The man stopped a few feet away, studying her with an intensity that penetrated even her fog of cold and exhaustion. His face was hard, all sharp angles and severe lines, with eyes that held no softness. This was not a man who smiled easily, if at all. "You'll die here if I don't do something," he said. His voice was deep, measured, without a trace of emotion. It was a statement of fact, not concern. Clara tried to speak, to tell him she was a nurse, that she wasn't simply some beggar seeking charity, but her lips would not form the words. All that came out was a shallow breath that hung white in the air between them. Francis Hargrave, Duke of Blackmore, had not intended to check the gates himself that evening. He had been working in his study, reviewing the estate accounts, when his steward had mentioned seeing someone near the entrance earlier. A woman, possibly. Francis had dismissed it initially, Vagrants occasionally sought shelter near estate walls during harsh weather, and his staff knew to provide them with food and directions to the village. But something had nagged at him. Perhaps it was the unusual severity of the storm, or the steward's uncertainty about whether the woman had moved on. Whatever the reason, Francis had found himself pulling on his coat and walking out into the bitter night. He recognized immediately what he was looking at. Not a vagrant. Not a servant seeking employment. The satchel at her feet was leather, well-made though worn. Her clothing, though travel-stained and inadequate for the weather, had been quality once. And her hands, even blue with cold, he could see they were the hands of someone who worked with precision, not manual labor. Medical training. He would stake his considerable fortune on it. For a moment, Francis considered his options with the cold calculation that had served him well throughout his life. He could send for his housekeeper, have the woman brought inside and cared for by staff. He could provide basic assistance and send her on her way come morning. He could even leave her to whatever fate had brought her to his gates. He owed nothing to strangers, and sentiment was a luxury he had learned to do without. But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, he was already moving forward. He bent and scooped her up with an efficiency that spoke of physical strength carefully maintained. She weighed almost nothing, and that troubled him more than he cared to admit. When had she last eaten properly? Her eyes fluttered open briefly, dark and confused, before closing again. Francis retrieved the satchel with his free hand and turned back toward the manor. The snow had already begun to cover the impression where she had been sitting, erasing her presence as if she had never been there at all. The warmth of the entrance hall struck like a physical blow after the cold outside. Francis didn't pause, carrying his burden past the startled footman and heading directly for the east wing where guest chambers were kept. Behind him, he could hear the rush of activity as staff mobilized, someone running for the housekeeper, another stoking fires, the clatter of preparations for an unexpected arrival. "Mrs. Bramwell," Francis called out, his voice carrying the authority that made people move quickly in his household. "Guest chamber, immediately. Hot water, blankets, and fetch Dr. Morrison from the village if the roads are still passable." The housekeeper, a stern woman in her 50s who had served the Hargrave family for 3 decades, appeared at his elbow. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the woman in his arms, but she recovered quickly. "At once, Your Grace. Shall I prepare the blue room? The one nearest the stairs. I want her close enough to hear if there's any trouble." Francis wasn't sure why he added that last part. Trouble from what? Yet some instinct told him this woman came with complications attached. He laid Clara on the bed as carefully as he might handle something fragile and valuable. In the firelight of the chamber, he could see her properly for the first time. Young, perhaps mid-20s. Dark hair escaping from a simple bun, tangled with melting snow. A face that would be pretty if it weren't so pale and drawn. But it was her hands that held his attention again, red and chapped from cold but unmistakably capable. Mrs. Bramwell bustled in with 2 maids carrying linens and a basin of warm water. "Out, Your Grace," she said with the familiar firmness she had used on him since he was a boy. "This is women's work now." Francis found himself reluctant to leave, which irritated him. He had done what was necessary. The woman would be cared for. There was no reason for him to remain. Yet he paused at the doorway. "Her satchel. Don't touch it until she's conscious. And Mrs. Bramwell, she's not to be disturbed by anyone outside this household. No gossip to the village, no questions. Is that understood?" The housekeeper's expression sharpened with understanding. "Of course, Your Grace. The young woman is our guest, and her privacy will be protected." Francis nodded and withdrew to his study, but found he could not focus on the papers that had occupied him earlier. Instead, he stood before the fire, one hand braced against the mantel, staring into the flames. He knew what he had brought into his house. Someone running from something. Someone with training and skill who had been reduced to freezing on his doorstep. The satchel alone told a story, a professional carrying her tools and credentials, suggesting she had been cast out rather than choosing to leave. The question was what to do with her once she recovered. Francis had been searching for months for someone with genuine medical training. The estate village had suffered 3 serious accidents in the past year, A boy who had nearly died from a threshing injury, a woman who had lost her child in a difficult birth, and an elderly tenant who had succumbed to fever that might have been treatable with proper care. The local physician was aging and unreliable, more interested in his brandy than his patients. What Francis needed was someone competent, someone who could be counted on when crisis struck. Someone who owed their position entirely to him and would therefore be loyal above all else. He had not expected such a person to literally appear at his gates, half frozen and desperate. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter." Mrs. Bramwell stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "The young woman is stable, Your Grace. We've warmed her slowly and given her hot tea. Dr. Morrison cannot make it through the snow tonight, but I don't believe she requires his services. She's suffering from exposure and exhaustion, nothing more. She'll recover with rest and proper care." "But has she spoken?" "Not yet. She drifted off to sleep almost immediately once she was warm." "But Your Grace." The housekeeper hesitated, which was unlike her. "I took the liberty of examining her belongings, just to ensure there was nothing dangerous. The satchel contains medical instruments and papers. Certificates of training from St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London." Francis turned to face her fully. "St. Bartholomew's? That's one of the finest teaching hospitals in England." "Yes, Your Grace. Which makes one wonder what a nurse with such training is doing half frozen at our gates in the middle of winter." Mrs. Bramwell's tone made it clear she had her suspicions, and none of them were charitable. "That," Francis said quietly, "is what I intend to discover. But not tonight. Let her rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough for questions." After the housekeeper departed, Francis returned to the window, watching the snow continue its relentless fall. Somewhere in that white darkness lay the road back to whatever life the woman had fled. But the storm was erasing that path, cutting her off from her past as surely as if it had never existed. Perhaps that was for the best. He had saved her life tonight. That created a certain obligation, one that ran both ways. She would owe him for shelter and protection. And he needed what she could provide. It was a transaction, nothing more. Francis had built his considerable success on recognizing opportunities when they presented themselves, and this woman, whoever she was, whatever she was running from, represented exactly the opportunity he had been seeking. Tomorrow he would make her an offer. One that would benefit them both, provided she was sensible enough to accept it. He did not consider that she might refuse. In Francis Hargrave's experience, desperate people rarely turned down lifelines, no matter what strings were attached. Clara woke to softness. It was such a foreign sensation after weeks of hard coach benches, cheapened mattresses, and finally that terrible wooden bench in the snow, that for a moment she thought she must still be dreaming. But dreams didn't come with the crackling sound of a well-tended fire, or the weight of what felt like half a dozen warm blankets, or the faint scent of lavender from the linens. She opened her eyes slowly, taking in her surroundings with the careful assessment that had been trained into her. A large bedchamber, well-appointed but not ostentatious. Cream-colored walls with dark wood paneling. Heavy curtains drawn against windows that showed only the gray light of early morning. A fire burning steadily in a marble fireplace, and beside it, a woman in a housekeeper's dress sitting in a straight-backed chair. The woman noticed her stirring immediately and rose. "Good morning, miss. You gave us quite a fright. How are you feeling?" Clara's throat was dry, her voice rough when she spoke. "Where am I?" "Blackmore Manor. His Grace the Duke found you at the gates last evening, nearly frozen through. He brought you inside himself." The housekeeper moved to a side table and poured water from a pitcher into a glass. "I'm Mrs. Bramwell. I manage the household here." Clara accepted the water gratefully, her mind racing even as she drank. She remembered now, the figure emerging from the snow, the hard voice stating she would die, the sensation of being lifted. After that, only fragments. Warmth, voices, the blessed relief of blankets. "My satchel," she said suddenly, setting down the glass. "I had a leather satchel. Safe and untouched beside the wardrobe, miss. His Grace was quite specific that it not be disturbed." Mrs. Bramwell's expression was professionally neutral, but Clara could read the curiosity behind it. "Are you well enough to sit up? I can have breakfast brought if you're feeling up to it." Clara pushed herself upright despite the lingering weakness in her limbs. She was still wearing her chemise, she realized, though someone had removed her outer clothing. I should speak with the Duke. To thank him. And she hesitated, unsure how to proceed. To ask for employment? To beg for more charity? To explain why she had been at his gates in the first place? His Grace anticipated that you would wish to speak with him once you were recovered. He asked that you join him in his study when you are able. Mrs. Bramwell moved toward the door. "I'll have hot water sent up so you may wash and something to eat. Your clothes have been cleaned and pressed. Take your rooms. His Grace is not a man who rushes, and he will wait." Left alone, Clara slid from the bed and went to the window, pulling back the curtain. The snow had stopped, leaving the grounds of Blackmore Manor transformed into a landscape of pristine white. The manor itself was impressive, gray stone that spoke of centuries, with additions that suggested wealth carefully maintained across generations. This was old money, old power, and she was here on the Duke's sufferance, nothing more. Clara turned to her satchel, relieved beyond measure to find it where Mrs. Bramwell had indicated. She opened it with trembling hands, checking the contents. Everything was there: her instruments, her certificates, even the few coins she had left. More than that, someone had dried the papers carefully, laying them flat so they wouldn't wrinkle. She pulled out her certificate from St. Bartholomew's, looking at the familiar script. "This is to certify that Clara Whitfield has completed training in nursing and surgical assistance." It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had received this, full of hope and purpose. Before Dr. Edmund Price had decided that a nurse who rejected his advances and reported his misconduct to hospital administrators was a threat to be eliminated. She had been naive to think the truth would matter, that her documented evidence would be enough. Price was celebrated, connected, and charming when he needed to be. Clara was nobody, and when he began spreading whispers that she was incompetent, that she had made dangerous mistakes, that her accusations were the delusions of a hysterical woman seeking attention, the hospital had quietly asked her to resign. No other hospital in London would consider her. Price had seen to that. So she had taken what little money she had and fled, hoping to find work somewhere far from his influence. She had made it as far as Blackmore before her resources ran out entirely. Now she stood in the guest chamber of a duke who had saved her life, and she had no idea what came next. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she could not afford to fail again. Whatever the Duke of Blackmore wanted in exchange for his rescue, she would find a way to provide it. She owed him that much. And more than that, she owed it to herself to survive. An hour later, washed, dressed, and fed, Clara followed a footman through the corridors of Blackmore Manor to the Duke's study. Her heart beat unevenly in her chest, not from the exertion but from nerves. She had no idea what to expect from this meeting, what this hard, forbidding man might want from her. The footman knocked, announced her, and withdrew, leaving Clara standing in the doorway of a room that was all dark wood, leather, and books. And at the center of it, behind a massive desk, sat the man who had carried her out of the snow. In the daylight, Francis Hargrave was even more imposing than she remembered. He was perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes that were a striking pale gray, the color of ice or steel. His face was all hard planes and angles, handsome in the way a well-made weapon might be handsome. This was not a man who smiled for the sake of courtesy. He rose as she entered, a gesture of manners from another era. "Miss Whitfield, I trust you are recovered." He knew her name. Of course he did. It would have been on her certificates. "I am your Grace. Thanks to your intervention. I owe you my life." "You owe me nothing yet," Francis said, gesturing to a chair before his desk. "Please sit. We have matters to discuss." Clara sat, keeping her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Every instinct told her this was a negotiation, and she would need all her wits about her. Francis resumed his own seat, studying her with that unsettling intensity. "I will be direct, Miss Whitfield. I do not make a habit of rescuing strangers, And I did not bring you into my home out of pure charity. I have need of someone with your skills. My skills? Clara kept her voice steady, though hope flickered dangerously in her chest. You are a trained nurse from St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Those credentials do not come cheaply or easily. Yet I found you freezing at my gates, obviously in flight from something, with no apparent means of support. He leaned back slightly. I am not interested in prying into whatever scandal drove you from London. What I am interested in is practical competence. My estate village has been without reliable medical care for too long. I need someone who can treat injuries, attend difficult births, manage common illnesses, and know when to send for a proper physician. Clara's mind raced. This was more than she had dared hope for, not just shelter, but employment, purpose, a reason to stay. But years of hard lessons had taught her caution. And in exchange? In exchange, you will live here at the Manor, with a private room, meals provided, and a salary appropriate to your training. You will be under my protection, which in this county means something. No one will question your presence or your past while you are part of my household. His expression didn't change, but something in his tone suggested this protection was not a small thing. You will have access to my library, my resources, and my authority when dealing with estate matters. What I expect in return is loyalty, competence, and discretion. It was almost too good to be true, which made Clara suspicious. Why me? You could send to London for any number of qualified nurses. True. But they would come with references, connections, obligations to the institutions that train them. You come with none of that. You are, through no fault of your own, I suspect, free of entanglements. Francis's eyes held hers steadily. And you are desperate enough to accept terms that others might find too demanding. There was the honest calculation beneath the offer. Clara found herself oddly grateful for it. Better this brutal clarity than false kindness masking hidden expectations. What terms, specifically? You will not leave the estate without my permission. You will report directly to me, not my steward or housekeeper, regarding any medical matters. You will keep detailed records of treatments and outcomes. And you will do nothing to bring scandal or unwanted attention to this household. He paused. I am not a patient man, Miss Whitfield, nor a particularly kind one. But I am fair and I protect what is mine. If you accept this position, you will be mine to protect. Do you understand? The possessive phrasing should have alarmed her. Perhaps it would have, in another life. But Clara had learned in the cruelest way possible that protection was not freely given in this world, and that a clear transaction was better than false promises. She thought of Dr. Price, of his charming lies and the destruction he had wrought with them. This duke offered her no charm, no promises of affection or admiration. Just cold honesty and the stark exchange of services for security. It was more than she had any right to expect. I understand, Your Grace. And I accept. Something flickered in Francis's expression, satisfaction, perhaps, or merely confirmation of an expectation met. Good. Mrs. Bramwell will show you to your permanent quarters in the East Wing. You'll begin your duties tomorrow. For today, rest and familiarize yourself with the manor. I'll have the steward bring you maps of the estate and village, and a list of tenants who may require your attention. He rose, signaling the interview was over. Clara stood as well, but found herself hesitating. Your Grace, may I ask why? You say you aren't kind, and you clearly didn't rescue me out of sentiment. But you could have left me at those gates. Francis walked to the window, looking out over his snow-covered lands. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less certain. I could have, but I've learned that opportunities present themselves in unexpected forms, and a wise man recognizes them when they appear. You needed rescuing. I needed competent medical care for my people. It was a simple matter of recognizing mutual benefit. It should have sounded cold. Calculating. Perhaps it did. But Clara found herself believing him because it made sense in a way that false kindness never had. Then I will do my best to prove your calculation correct, Your Grace. He turned back to her, and for just a moment, something that might have been approval crossed his severe features. See that you do, Miss Whitfield. I dislike being proven wrong. As Clara left the study and followed Mrs. Bramwell to what would be her new rooms, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Not quite hope, she had learned to be wary of that. But perhaps its quieter cousin, possibility. She was safe. She had purpose. And the man who had given her both expected nothing from her except competence and loyalty. After everything she had been through, that felt like more than enough. The room Mrs. Bramwell led Clara to was nothing like the grand guest chamber where she had awakened. It was smaller, more practical, tucked into the east wing with a view of the kitchen gardens and the path leading to the village beyond. But it was clean, warm, and most importantly, it was hers. This was the previous governess's room, Mrs. Bramwell explained, setting down the lamp she carried. Before the last of His Grace's wards came of age and left for school. It's been empty these 2 years, but we've kept it maintained. She moved to the small fireplace and checked that it was properly laid. You'll have privacy here. The other staff quarters are in the west wing. Clara set her satchel on the simple writing desk beneath the window. The room contained a narrow bed with a thick mattress, a wardrobe that looked sturdy if plain, 2 chairs, and that desk. Modest by the standards of the grand house, but luxury compared to the rooms she had rented during her flight from London. It's perfect, Clara said quietly. Thank you, Mrs. Bramwell. The housekeeper's expression softened slightly. His Grace runs a strict household, Miss Whitfield, but he's not unkind to those who serve him well. You'll find your place here if you're as capable as your certificate suggests. She moved toward the door, then paused. A word of advice, if I may? The Duke values honesty and competence above all else. Don't try to be more than you are, and don't pretend to know what you don't. He'll respect you for it. After she left, Clara unpacked her meager belongings, her hands moving automatically while her mind turned over the morning's conversation. The Duke's offer had been everything she needed: shelter, employment, protection. Yet something about the directness of it left her unsettled. You will be mine to protect. The words echoed in her memory. Not under my protection, or in my employ. As if she were a possession acquired, a tool to be used. But wasn't that exactly what this was? A transaction. Her skills in exchange for his protection. She had entered into it with eyes open, accepting terms that were harsh but clear. That should have been a relief after the duplicity she had faced in London. So why did she feel as though she had agreed to something more complicated than either of them had said aloud? A knock interrupted her thoughts. A young maid appeared with a tray. Mrs. Bramwell said you're to have a proper meal, miss. Cook's made lamb stew and fresh bread. The smell alone made Clara's stomach clench with hunger. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she had eaten a full meal. Thank you. What's your name? Annie, miss. The girl set the tray on the small table. I'm to help you settle in if you need anything. I think I have everything I need, Annie. But thank you. After the maid left, Clara sat and ate slowly, forcing herself not to rush despite her hunger. The stew was rich and perfectly seasoned, the bread still warm from the oven. As she ate, she watched through the window as staff moved about their duties, a gardener checking the cold frames, a footman carrying wood for the fires, a groom leading horses toward the stables. It was a well-run household. Everything moved with purpose and efficiency, the kind that came from clear expectations and consistent management. The Duke's influence was evident in every corner of his domain. That evening, as promised, the steward arrived with maps and documents. Mr. Thornton was a lean man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested he missed nothing. His Grace has instructed me to provide you with everything you need to understand the estate, Miss Whitfield. He spread a detailed map across her desk. The village of Blackmoor is here, half a mile down the main road. 43 families, most of whom work the estate lands or in the Duke's employ. The outlying farms extend here and here. His finger traced the boundaries. In winter, some of the more remote cottages can be difficult to reach. Clara studied the map carefully, committing it to memory. How many people in total? Approximately 200 souls, give or take. More during harvest when we bring in seasonal workers. Thornton produced another document. This is a list of current concerns. Old Thomas Green has been suffering with his lungs these past weeks. Mary Fletcher is due to deliver her fourth child within the month. The blacksmith's apprentice burned his arm badly last week. It's been treated, but someone should check for infection. The list went on. Clara felt a familiar stirring of purpose as she read through the cases. This was real work, important work. People who needed care. The previous physician, she asked carefully, does he still practice in the village? Dr. Hackett? He lives there still, but His Grace no longer calls on his services. Thornton's tone was diplomatically neutral. The doctor's skills have diminished with age and other influences. His Grace has been seeking a replacement for some time. Other influences. Clara understood. She had seen enough physicians whose hands shook from drink to recognize the euphemism. I'll need supplies, she said, already making mental lists. Clean bandages, herbs for poultices, basic medicines. And I should introduce myself to the families, establish trust before there's an emergency. His Grace anticipated as much. He's instructed me to provide whatever funds you require within reason. You'll submit your expenses to me weekly. Thornton's expression remained professionally blank, but Clara sensed approval in his tone. You may begin your rounds tomorrow if you feel ready. After he left, Clara sat at her desk and began making detailed notes. She organized the patient list by urgency, planned her route through the village, and compiled a list of supplies she would need. The work was familiar, comforting in its practicality. She was so absorbed that she didn't notice the hour growing late until Annie returned to build up her fire. Begging your pardon, miss, but you should rest. You've only just recovered yourself. Clara looked up, surprised to find darkness beyond her window. You're right. Thank you, Annie. But after the maid left, Clara found herself standing at the window, looking out toward the village lights twinkling in the distance. Somewhere down that path were people who needed her skills. People who didn't know about Dr. Price's accusations, who would judge her only on her competence. For the first time in months, she felt something close to hope. In his study, Francis Hargrave sat with a glass of brandy, ostensibly reviewing correspondence but finding his attention wandering to the window that overlooked the east wing. He could see the light burning in Miss Whitfield's room. Working late, he presumed. Thornton had reported that she had asked intelligent questions and taken thorough notes. Exactly the kind of diligence Francis had hoped for when he made his offer. Yet he found himself thinking about her in ways that had nothing to do with her professional qualifications. There had been something in her eyes during their conversation that morning. A wariness that spoke of harsh lessons learned. She had accepted his terms quickly enough, but not blindly. She understood exactly what kind of arrangement they had entered into, and she had weighed it carefully before agreeing. Francis respected that. He had no patience for people who deluded themselves about the nature of transactions, who dressed up business arrangements in pretty words and false sentiment. But he also recognized that Clara Whitfield was more complicated than he had initially assumed. The way she had asked about his motivations, the careful assessment in her expression, this was not a woman who would be easily managed. He had no use for someone who couldn't think for herself. Still, he would need to be careful. She was useful to him, and he could not afford to let other considerations interfere with that utility. He had brought her here to serve a practical purpose, and that purpose needed to remain primary. The problem was that Francis had always been a man who noticed details, and he had noticed quite a few about Clara Whitfield. The determination in her voice when she spoke of proving his calculation correct. The way her hands had moved with unconscious competence when she set down her water glass that morning, the efficiency of someone trained to precision. The intelligence in her dark eyes that suggested she saw far more than most people would prefer. He took a sip of brandy, annoyed with himself. This was exactly the kind of complicated thinking he had trained himself to avoid. Clara Whitfield was an employee. A valuable one, potentially, but still an employee. The fact that she was also an intriguing woman with a mysterious past was irrelevant. Except that it wasn't quite. Francis set down his glass and stood, moving to the window. In the distance, the light in Clara's room finally went dark. She had stopped working and gone to bed, sensible and practical as everything else about her seemed to be. Tomorrow she would begin her duties. She would meet his tenants, assess their needs, and start to prove whether she was truly as competent as her certificate suggested. Francis would observe from a distance, measuring her performance, ensuring his investment paid appropriate dividends. That was all this was. An investment. A calculated risk that appeared to be paying off exactly as he had anticipated. He told himself that firmly, and almost believed it. The next morning dawned cold but clear. Clara dressed carefully in her most practical clothing. A dark wool dress, warm cloak, sturdy boots. She braided her hair tightly and pinned it in a simple coil. This was work, not social calling, and she needed to look competent rather than fashionable. Mrs. Bramwell had arranged for a basket to be prepared with basic supplies. Clara added her own instruments, carefully wrapped, and her notebook. She was checking her preparations one final time when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find not a servant, but the Duke himself. "Your Grace." Clara stepped back instinctively. "I was just about to depart for the village." "I know. I came to ensure you had everything you needed." Francis's gaze swept over her preparations with the same assessing quality he seemed to bring to everything. "Thornton provided you with the maps and patient list?" "Yes, Your Grace. I've planned my route to address the most urgent cases first." "Good." He paused, and for a moment Clara thought he might say something more. Then he simply nodded. "The tenants will be curious about you. There will be questions about where you came from and why you're here. You're not obligated to answer them, but if you choose to, keep it simple. You trained in London and have come to provide medical care for the estate. Nothing more." It was both permission and instruction. Clara understood the subtext. Her past was to remain her past, protected by the wall of his authority. "I understand. One more thing." Francis's expression remained stern, but something in his tone shifted slightly. "If you encounter any difficulty, resistance, disrespect, anything that prevents you from doing your work effectively, you will inform me immediately. Is that clear?" Clara met his eyes steadily. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." "Then you may proceed. I'll expect your report this evening." He left without further ceremony, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Clara stood for a moment, processing the encounter. The Duke had come personally to see her off, to ensure she understood the parameters of her position and the extent of his protection. It should have felt controlling. Instead, it felt oddly reassuring. She picked up her basket and set out for the village, her breath misting in the cold morning air. The path was well maintained, the snow cleared from the main road. As she walked, Clara found herself thinking about the Duke's final instruction. "You will inform me immediately." Not a request, a command, but also, in its way, a promise. She would not face whatever challenges awaited her alone. Perhaps this arrangement, harsh and transactional as it was, might prove to be exactly what she needed. The village of Blackmore came into view as she rounded a bend, a collection of stone cottages with smoke rising from their chimneys, a small church with a modest steeple, and what appeared to be a general store. It looked peaceful, prosperous enough by rural standards. Clara squared her shoulders and walked forward, ready to begin proving that the Duke's calculation had been correct. Behind her, unseen, Francis stood at his study window, watching her figure grow smaller in the distance. He told himself he was simply ensuring his new employee began her duties properly. But he remained at the window long after she disappeared from view, and that troubled him more than he cared to admit. Clara had been at Blackmore Manor for 3 weeks when everything changed. The days had fallen into a rhythm she found unexpectedly satisfying. Morning rounds through the village, treating minor ailments and checking on chronic conditions. Afternoons spent preparing medicines in the small workroom Mrs. Bramwell had cleared for her use. Evenings documenting cases and reporting to the Duke, brief, professional conversations where he asked pointed questions and she provided detailed answers. The tenants had been wary at first, as Francis had predicted. A young woman, unmarked by the usual signs of spinsterhood or widowhood, appearing suddenly under the Duke's protection, it invited speculation. But Clara had learned to let her work speak for itself. She treated the blacksmith's burned arm and prevented infection. She helped Mary Fletcher through a difficult labor that resulted in a healthy baby girl. She sat with old Thomas Green and eased his breathing with steam treatments and carefully prepared tisanes. Slowly, cautiously, the people of Blackmore began to trust her. Clara was in the village that afternoon, delivering medicine to the vicar's wife, when young Jamie Fletcher came running up the path, his face white with panic. "Miss Whitfield. Miss, you have to come quick. There's been an accident at the mill." Clara's training took over instantly. "What kind of accident?" "The new shaft, it broke loose. Caught Will Cooper's arm. There's blood everywhere, miss. So much blood." The boy was trembling. Clara grabbed her medical bag from the vicar's parlor. "Run ahead and tell them I'm coming. And Jamie, tell them to elevate his arm and apply direct pressure to the wound. Do you understand?" The boy nodded and took off at a sprint. The mill was a quarter-mile up the river, and Clara ran the entire distance, her cloak flying behind her. She could hear the commotion before she saw it. Men shouting, a woman screaming. As she burst through the mill door, she took in the scene with the clinical assessment that had been drilled into her. Will Cooper, a man in his 30s, lay on the floor surrounded by workers. His left arm was mangled from elbow to wrist, the fabric of his shirt soaked crimson. Someone had tied a belt above the wound as a tourniquet, which had slowed but not stopped the bleeding. Will's face was gray, his breathing shallow. He was going into shock. Minutes mattered. Clear space. Clara's voice cut through the chaos with unexpected authority. "I need clean water, all the lamps you can find, and someone fetch whiskey, the strongest you have." The mill workers stared at her for a frozen moment. Then Mr. Fletcher, Jamie's father, and the mill foreman began shouting orders. Men scrambled to comply. Clara knelt beside Will, her hands already assessing the damage. The injury was severe: crushed bone, torn muscle, bleeding from what appeared to be a severed artery. In London, in a proper surgical theater, this would be challenging. Here, in a dusty mill with improvised tools, it was nearly impossible. But nearly impossible was not the same as impossible. "Will, can you hear me?" She leaned close to his face. His eyes fluttered open. "Hurts," he whispered. "Hurts so much." "I know. I'm going to help you, but you need to stay conscious. Can you do that for me?" She looked up at the men surrounding them. "Someone hold his shoulders. This is going to be painful." She worked with focused intensity, blocking out everything except the wound before her. First, she located the severed artery and clamped it with a hemostat from her bag. Precious instrument, but this was exactly what it was for. The bleeding slowed to a manageable flow. Then she began the painstaking work of cleaning the wound, removing debris, assessing what could be saved. The crushed section of forearm was beyond repair. The bones were splintered, the tissue destroyed. If she didn't act decisively, infection would set in and kill him within days. Clara had assisted with amputations during her training, but she had never performed one alone. Her hands trembled for just a moment as she reached for her surgical knife. Then she steadied them through sheer force of will. Will Cooper's life depended on her competence. There was no room for doubt. "Hold him tightly," she said quietly. "This must be done quickly." What followed was the longest 10 minutes of Clara's life. She worked with the precision her teachers had demanded, making clean cuts, tying off blood vessels, preserving as much healthy tissue as possible. Will screamed twice before passing out from the pain, which was a mercy. The men holding him remained steady, though she could feel their horror in the silence that surrounded her work. Finally it was done. The mangled portion of the arm was removed, the stump carefully sutured and bandaged. Will's breathing had steadied slightly, though he remained unconscious. Clara sat back on her heels, her hands and dress covered in blood, and allowed herself one shaking breath. "He needs to be moved to his home," she said, her voice rougher than she intended. "Carefully. And I'll need to stay with him through the night to watch for fever. Mr. Fletcher, can you arrange transport?" "Already done, miss." The foreman's voice was subdued with shock and something that might have been respect. "My sons are bringing a cart." As they lifted Will onto the makeshift stretcher, one of the younger workers spoke up. "You saved him, miss. He'd have bled out for certain if you hadn't been here." Clara didn't respond. She was too busy calculating medication doses and monitoring Will's vital signs. But she felt the shift in the room, the way the men looked at her now. Not with suspicion or curiosity, but with something far more powerful. Trust. Genuine, hard-won trust. Francis was in a meeting with his land agent when Thornton entered without knocking, which was unprecedented enough to make Francis break off mid-sentence. "Your Grace, there's been an accident at the mill. Miss Whitfield is there now." Francis was out of his chair before Thornton finished speaking. "How serious?" "Will Cooper lost his arm. Miss Whitfield performed an amputation on site." The steward's expression was carefully controlled, but Francis could read the shock beneath it. "They're transporting him to his cottage now. She's requested permission to stay through the night to monitor his condition." Francis was already reaching for his coat. "Permission granted. Have Mrs. Bramwell prepare supplies and send them to the Cooper cottage. And Thornton, send word to Dr. Hackett that his services are not required." He rode to the village himself, something he rarely did for anything short of a crisis. When he arrived at the Cooper cottage, he found it surrounded by villagers speaking in hushed, urgent tones. They parted to let him through, their faces reflecting mingled shock and something like awe. Inside, the small main room had been converted into a sick room. Will Cooper lay on a bed near the fire, deeply unconscious but breathing steadily. His wife sat beside him, holding his remaining hand and weeping quietly. And at the bedside, checking his pulse and adjusting his bandages, was Clara. She looked up when Francis entered, and for a moment their eyes met. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her dress stained with blood, her hair escaping its pins. But her hands were steady, and her expression was calm. "Your Grace." She stood and curtsied, though the formality seemed absurd given the circumstances. "I apologize for the breach in protocol, but I couldn't leave him." "Protocol be damned," Francis said quietly. "What's his prognosis? If infection doesn't set in, he should survive. I've cleaned the wound thoroughly and the amputation was as clean as I could manage under the circumstances. The next 48 hours will tell." She glanced back at Will. "He'll need time to adjust, and he won't be able to work in the mill, but he can learn a new trade. He has his life, and that's what matters." Francis studied her for a long moment. "You performed an amputation in a mill. Alone. With improvised equipment." "I had proper instruments in my bag. And I had training." She met his gaze levelly. "It was necessary. It was extraordinary." Francis was not a man given to praise, but facts were facts. "Thornton will ensure the Cooper family is provided for during Will's recovery. And you," he gestured toward the door. "You need rest. I'll have someone relieve you. With respect, Your Grace, I need to monitor him through the night. The risk of hemorrhage or fever is highest in the first 12 hours. Clara's tone was polite but immovable. "Mrs. Bramwell has sent supplies. I can manage." Francis recognized the futility of arguing. "Then I'll have food and additional blankets sent. You'll report to me tomorrow morning with a full account." As he turned to leave, he paused. "Miss Whitfield? Well done." It was the closest thing to emotion he had allowed to enter his voice in longer than he could remember. From the slight widening of her eyes, Clara recognized it. "Thank you, Your Grace." Francis left the cottage and found himself surrounded by villagers. Mr. Fletcher stepped forward, cap in hand. "Your Grace, if I may, Miss Whitfield saved Will's life today. Without her, he'd have bled out before we could even send for a doctor. She didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. Just stepped in and did what needed doing." The foreman's weathered face was solemn. "We misjudged her, Your Grace. We thought, well, it doesn't matter what we thought. But we were wrong." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Francis looked at the faces around him, his tenants, his workers, people he had known all his life, and saw the shift that had occurred. Clara Whitfield was no longer an outsider under his dubious protection. She was one of them now, earned through blood and competence. "Miss Whitfield is under my employ and my protection," Francis said clearly, his voice carrying to everyone assembled. "Anyone who doubts her skill or her right to practice medicine on this estate will answer to me personally. Is that understood?" The crowd nodded, but Francis could see it was unnecessary. They had already made up their minds. As he rode back to the manor, Francis found himself thinking about the woman he had found freezing at his gates 3 weeks ago. He had calculated correctly. She was exactly what he needed. Competent, dedicated, capable of earning trust. What he hadn't calculated was how much her presence would begin to matter beyond mere utility. Clara stayed with Will Cooper through that night and into the next day. When he finally woke, groggy and in pain but alive, she administered laudanum and explained carefully what had happened. His wife wept with relief, and Will himself, after the initial shock, gripped Clara's hand with surprising strength. "Thank you, miss. For my life." Clara returned to the manor late that afternoon, exhausted to her bones. She had barely reached her room when Annie appeared with a message that the Duke required her presence in his study. She washed her face and changed into a clean dress, but couldn't summon the energy to do more. She made her way to the study feeling as though she might collapse at any moment. Francis looked up from his desk when she entered. His expression flickered, concern, perhaps, though it passed too quickly to be certain. "Sit," he said not unkindly. "You look ready to fall over." Clara sank into the chair gratefully. "Will Cooper is stable. He should recover fully, though he'll need time and assistance learning to work with one hand. Already arranged. He'll have employment suited to his new circumstances, and his family will not suffer financially." Francis poured brandy into 2 glasses, unusual, as he had never offered her spirits before. He pushed one across the desk to her. "Drink. Doctor's orders, if you will." Clara accepted it, too tired to argue. The brandy burned pleasantly as it went down. "What you did yesterday," Francis began, then paused. "It was remarkable. Not just the technical skill, though that was evident, but the decisiveness, the calm under pressure. These are not qualities that can be taught." "I was trained for such situations, Your Grace." "Perhaps. But training and execution are different things." He studied her with that penetrating gaze. "You've proven yourself beyond any doubt. The entire estate knows it. You've won something far more valuable than my approval. You've earned the trust of people who are notoriously slow to give it." Clara felt warmth that had nothing to do with the brandy. "I simply did what was necessary." "That's precisely the point." Francis leaned back slightly. "You do what's necessary without hesitation or drama. It's a rare quality, Miss Whitfield. One I value highly." Before Clara could respond, Thornton entered, his expression troubled. "Your Grace, there's a visitor at the gate. A Dr. Edmund Price from London. He's demanding to speak with you regarding Miss Whitfield." The brandy glass slipped from Clara's fingers, falling to the carpet with a dull thud. Everything, the warmth, the praise, the hard-won safety, shattered in an instant. Edmund Price. Somehow, impossibly, he had found her. Francis's expression transformed from measured approval to something cold and dangerous. His eyes moved from Thornton to Clara, taking in her white face and trembling hands. "I see." His voice was soft, deadly. "Miss Whitfield, who is Dr. Edmund Price?" Clara forced herself to meet his gaze, though shame burned through her. "He's the physician I reported for misconduct in London. The one who destroyed my career and drove me from the city." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He's the reason I was at your gates." Francis stood slowly, and Clara saw something in his expression she had never seen before. Not anger directed at her, but something far more focused. Far more lethal. "Thornton," he said quietly, "show Dr. Price to the drawing room. Tell him I'll see him shortly." He looked down at Clara. "You will remain here. Do not leave this room, and do not speak to him under any circumstances. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, unable to speak past the fear closing her throat. "Good." Francis moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Whitfield? Whatever this man has come to do, whatever threats he brings, he will not succeed. You are under my protection, and I do not yield what is mine. Remember that." Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone in the study, her heart pounding and her carefully rebuilt world threatening to collapse once more. Clara sat frozen in the Duke's study, her hands gripping the arms of the chair as if it were the only solid thing in a tilting world. Through the heavy door, she could hear nothing, but her imagination supplied what her ears could not: Edmund Price's smooth voice, his plausible lies, the calculated charm he wielded like a surgeon's knife. He had found her. After 3 weeks of peace, of purpose, of slowly believing she might have a future, he had found her. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Clara's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Price could claim she had stolen supplies from the hospital. He could say she was mentally unstable, dangerous to patients. He could produce forged documents, false witnesses. He had done it before in London, and he had been devastatingly effective. What defense did she have against a celebrated physician with connections throughout England's medical establishment? Her word? Her training certificates? They hadn't been enough before. The door opened. Clara's head snapped up. Francis entered, closing the door behind him with deliberate calm. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone. "Your Grace, Clara began, but he raised a hand. In a moment. He moved to his desk, poured himself a measure of brandy, and drank it in one swallow. Then he turned to face her fully. "Tell me everything. The truth from beginning to end. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with." Clara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Dr. Edmund Price was the senior surgeon at St. Bartholomew's when I completed my training. He was brilliant, respected, and utterly ruthless." The words came haltingly at first, then faster as the story poured out. "He made advances toward me. Repeatedly. When I rejected him, he became vindictive. And when I reported his misconduct to the hospital administrators after I witnessed him compromise a patient's care due to intoxication, he decided to destroy me." "How?" Francis's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. "He began a campaign of rumors. That I was incompetent. That I had made dangerous errors. That my accusations were the delusions of a hysterical woman seeking attention." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "He had the ear of every senior physician in London. Within weeks, I couldn't find work anywhere. The hospital asked me to resign quietly, to avoid scandal. I had no choice but to leave. And he's come here because he can't tolerate the possibility that I might rebuild my life somewhere beyond his reach." Bitterness leaked into Clara's voice. "He needs to ensure I'm completely destroyed. It's not enough that he ruined my career, he needs me broken entirely." Francis studied her for a long moment. "And the accusations he makes, are any of them true?" Clara met his eyes steadily. "No, Your Grace. I am exactly what my certificates say I am. Everything I've done here, every patient I've treated, that is the truth of my abilities. Price's claims are lies designed to protect his reputation and punish me for daring to challenge him." "Good." Francis moved to the window, his back to her. "Because Dr. Price has just spent 20 minutes in my drawing room making some extraordinary claims. That you're a fraud who falsified your training documents. That you're mentally unbalanced and dangerous to patients. That you fled London after being dismissed for gross incompetence." He turned back, and something like grim satisfaction crossed his features. "He's also threatened to bring legal action against you and anyone who employs you, unless I dismiss you immediately and turn you over to his custody for proper care." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Your Grace, I understand if you need to." "You understand nothing," Francis interrupted, his voice sharp. "Did you truly think I would simply hand you over to this man? That I would accept the word of a stranger over the evidence I've witnessed with my own eyes? But he has influence, connections, and I am the Duke of Blackmore." Francis's eyes glinted dangerously. "My family has held this title for 3 centuries. I have connections Dr. Price couldn't dream of, and influence that extends far beyond the medical establishment of London." He moved closer, looking down at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "More than that, I know what you are, Clara. I've watched you work. I've seen your skill, your dedication, your courage. Yesterday, you saved a man's life under impossible circumstances. That is truth. Whatever Price claims cannot change what I know to be fact." Clara felt something break loose in her chest. Fear, yes, but also a desperate, fragile hope. What are you going to do? I'm going to give Dr. Price exactly what he came for. Francis's smile was cold and predatory. A reckoning, but not the one he anticipated. He extended his hand to her. It's time to end this. Clara took his hand and rose on unsteady legs. Your Grace. Francis, he said quietly. When we're alone, you may call me Francis. I think we've moved beyond formality, don't you? Before she could respond, he was leading her from the study toward the drawing room. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but his hand remained steady around hers, an anchor in the storm. The drawing room was one of Blackmore Manor's finest spaces, designed to impress visitors with its elegant proportions and expensive furnishings. Dr. Edmund Price stood before the fireplace, the very picture of distinguished medical authority in his well-cut suit and silver-streaked hair. When Clara entered with Francis, Price's expression shifted from impatient superiority to cold satisfaction. Clara, how predictable that you would hide behind your latest protector. His voice was smooth, cultured, laced with condescension. Your Grace, I must thank you for producing her. It will make this matter much simpler. Dr. Price. Francis's tone could have frozen water. You've made serious allegations against Miss Whitfield. I believe she deserves the opportunity to face her accuser directly. There's no need for dramatics, Your Grace. The facts speak for themselves. Price produced a leather folder from his case. I have documentation here proving that Clara Whitfield was dismissed from St. Bartholomew's Hospital for incompetence and erratic behavior. I also have sworn statements from colleagues attesting to her instability. Clara felt her knees weaken, but Francis's hand tightened around hers, steadying her. Interesting, Francis said mildly. May I see these documents? Price handed them over with obvious confidence. Francis examined them slowly, his expression unchanging. Then he set them aside on a nearby table. These are impressive forgeries, Dr. Price. Quite professional. Price's smile faltered. I assure you, Your Grace, they are entirely authentic. They are lies. Francis's voice cracked like a whip. I have already sent inquiries to St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Miss Whitfield's actual records indicate she completed her training with distinction and resigned voluntarily. There is no mention of dismissal or incompetence. That's impossible. The hospital would never. The hospital has no reason to lie to a duke making official inquiries. Francis moved closer to Price, and suddenly the physician seemed smaller, diminished. What's more interesting is what else I discovered. Your own record at St. Bartholomew's includes several complaints about conduct unbecoming a physician. Complaints that were quietly buried, but not destroyed. Apparently, you have a pattern of inappropriate behavior toward female staff. The color drained from Price's face. Those accusations were investigated and dismissed. They were suppressed by men who valued institutional reputation over justice. Francis's voice was deadly quiet now. But they exist, and I have copies of every single one, obtained through channels you cannot challenge or discredit. Clara stared at Francis, stunned. He had investigated Price. He had found evidence. While she had been treating patients and winning the trust of his tenants, he had been methodically building a case against the man who had destroyed her. Price's composure was cracking. Your Grace, I don't know what this woman has told you, but she's manipulating you. The only manipulation here is yours, Doctor. Francis picked up the forged documents and held them up. You came to my home with false evidence, intending to intimidate me into surrendering a woman under my protection. That was your first mistake. Your second was underestimating what I would do to protect what is mine. She's a nobody, a disgraced nurse with no family, no connections. She is under the protection of the Duke of Blackmore, which makes her considerably more than a nobody. Francis's eyes blazed with cold fury. And as of this morning, following her successful treatment of a life-threatening emergency, she has the complete trust and loyalty of every tenant on my estate. That gives her more value than your entire career, Dr. Price. Price looked between them, his calculated charm evaporating into desperation. You don't understand what you're risking. My reputation. Your reputation is built on lies and the silence of women you've bullied into submission. Francis moved to the door and opened it, revealing Thornton and 2 footmen waiting outside. You have 1 hour to leave my estate. If you ever contact Miss Whitfield again, if you ever speak her name in public, if you so much as send a letter in her direction, I will ensure that every complaint ever filed against you becomes public knowledge. I will personally see to it that your career ends in disgrace and scandal. Am I making myself clear? Price's face twisted with impotent rage. You're making a mistake, Your Grace. She's nothing. She is everything, Francis said quietly, and Clara's breath stopped in her throat. And you, Dr. Price, are dismissed. Permanently. The footmen escorted Price from the room, his protests fading down the corridor. When the door closed behind them, silence fell like a curtain. Clara stood trembling, unable to quite believe what had just happened. You investigated him. You found evidence. Of course I did. Francis turned to her, his expression softening slightly. Did you think I wouldn't? The moment I learned why you had fled London, I began making inquiries. It took 2 weeks to find the right people, the ones who knew the truth but had been too afraid to speak it. But once I found them, he shrugged. Power has its uses, Clara, and I choose to use mine to protect you. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. I'm just a nurse you found freezing at your gates. Why would you go to such lengths? Francis was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower, more vulnerable than she had ever heard it. Because from the moment I brought you into this house, you became my responsibility. Because I watched you work with dedication and courage that humbled me. Because when I offered you protection, I meant it absolutely. He paused. And because somewhere in these past weeks, you stopped being simply a useful employee and became something far more important. Clara's heart was racing. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've spent my entire adult life avoiding complications, avoiding sentiment, avoiding anything that might compromise my control over my own life. Francis moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. And then you appeared, desperate and half-frozen, and you've systematically demolished every wall I built. You've made me care, Clara. You've made me feel things I thought I had trained myself never to feel. Francis. Clara's voice trembled on his name. I know this is improper. I know the circumstances of our arrangement make this complicated. But I need you to know that you are not simply under my protection. You are... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. You matter to me. Your safety, your happiness, your future, they matter more than is wise or sensible. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. I was so afraid. When Price arrived, I thought I would lose everything again. This place, this purpose, this life I was building. You will never lose it. Francis reached out and gently cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. You are part of Blackmore now. Part of my household, my estate, my life. No one can take that from you. I won't allow it. I don't know how to thank you, Clara whispered. Then don't. Just stay. Be exactly who you are. Brilliant, capable, impossible to intimidate. His expression softened into something that might have been tenderness. And if you find that you might feel something for a man who is too cold, too calculating, too damaged by life to be anyone's ideal, well, I would consider that gift enough. Clara felt something shift inside her, the final pieces of protective armor falling away. You're not cold. You're careful. You've been hurt, so you keep yourself guarded. She placed her hand over his where it still rested against her cheek. But you saved my life, Francis. You gave me purpose and protection and a home. You fought for me when no one else would. How could I not feel something for you? The kiss, when it came, was inevitably. Francis pulled her close with a gentleness that contradicted his stern reputation, and Clara melted into his embrace as if she had been waiting for this moment since that first night in the snow. When they finally broke apart, Francis rested his forehead against hers. This is madness. I should maintain professional distance. I should. You should stop overthinking, Clara said softly, a smile tugging at her lips. For once in your carefully calculated life, Francis Hargrave, just accept something good. He laughed. Actually laughed, a sound of genuine warmth that transformed his entire face. When did you become so wise? Somewhere between freezing to death and falling in love with a duke. The words slipped out before Clara could stop them, but she found she didn't want to take them back. Francis's expression turned serious. Say that again. I love you, Clara said, steady and sure. I didn't plan to. I didn't expect to. But I do. Good. Francis kissed her again, deeper this time, with a passion that spoke of feelings long denied. Because I love you too, Clara Whitfield. And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it. 3 months later, Clara stood in the village church of Blackmore, wearing a simple but elegant gown, her hand clasped in Francis's as the vicar pronounced them husband and wife. The church was filled to capacity. Every tenant, every worker, every family from the estate had come to witness their Duke marry the woman who had saved Will Cooper's life and earned her place among them through skill and courage. As they walked down the aisle together, Clara caught sight of Will standing near the back, his wife beside him, their new baby in her arms. He raised his remaining hand in salute, and Clara smiled back, remembering that desperate afternoon that had changed everything. Outside, in the spring sunshine that had melted the last of winter's snow, Francis pulled Clara aside for a private moment before they joined the celebration. Any regrets? He asked softly. Clara looked up at the man who had found her freezing at his gates and given her not just shelter, but a life beyond anything she had imagined. None. You. Only that I didn't find you sooner. Francis kissed her forehead, then her cheeks, then her lips. Thank you for appearing at my gates that night, Clara. Thank you for being too stubborn to die in the snow. Thank you for being too practical to leave me there, Clara replied, laughter in her voice. They were no longer just surviving. They were no longer simply a duke and his employee, bound by transaction and necessity. They were partners, equals. And most impossibly, most wonderfully, they were in love. The bitter winter that had brought them together was long past. Spring had come to Blackmore Manor, and with it, a future neither of them had dared to dream of. But they had earned it, together, through honesty and courage and the willingness to protect what mattered most. Each other.